Welcome back to Ether Realms, my friends. I'm your host, Sam, and it is time for the second installment of our Midwinter tale. I hope that you're ready, and I hope that you haven't been too discouraged. Getting a channel like this started and learning the ins and outs of doing voiceover narration and sound editing and uploading and all the technical ins and outs is somewhat daunting for me, and I've had my fair share of technical difficulties. But I'm hopeful that everything has been worked out and that we'll be able to get things going on a regular basis now. So without further ado, I'm going to present to you Midwinter Madness Part 2. For a while, we all just focused on the movie. Well, it seemed that's what everyone else was doing. I was still trying to wrap my head around what was happening, while still holding it all together. The footsteps in the snow, the moving doll, the creepy glowing eyes, Mom's TV, and, well, now she wouldn't wake up. It was like we were living in some sort of nightmare. We were just a bunch of kids. I was only 14 at the time, and while I was mature for my age, I was still struggling with keeping from crying and making Chris cry in the process. John and I exchanged worried looks for a bit. Every few moments he would look over at me and we would make eye contact. But soon he wasn't looking at me at all. He was staring at the TV. Now, I know what you're thinking. That was the point of sitting and watching the movie, right? To let it distract us from all of the craziness that was happening, but this wasn't him being into the movie. Amy and Chris were laughing, but John, well, it was more like he had just become catatonic. He wasn't reacting to what we were watching at all. I couldn't even see a change in his facial expressions. No movement in his eyes indicating that he was following anything on the screen. He just stared blankly ahead at the TV, eyes wide, slack-jawed, and not a hint of emotion. I couldn't help but keep shifting my eyes between the TV and the front door. With the footprints I watched form in the snow earlier, maybe I was just waiting for something to bust through the door and attack us. The way my muscles were tensed, I was ready to fight something even if I didn't know what it was, but nothing came through. Things seemed normal for a little while, and just as I started to relax, telling myself that we were all just tired, I noticed something strange. We had a rather large aquarium that sat near the front door as you went into the hallway. It caught my attention, and even now, looking back, I can't think of what would have caused this to happen. The water in the tank was suddenly very muddy looking. I mean, to the point of not even being able to see the fish that it housed. Now, there wasn't any mud in the tank. There were aquarium gravels, sure, but there wasn't enough muck in the bottom of the tank for those fish to stir up to darken the water that much. And what's more, well, it certainly wasn't going to change the water to a blood red color. The aquarium lights were my next thought, but there weren't any red ones. And it wasn't just a tint in the water. It was like the water itself had turned into something else. And then it changed again. Right before our eyes, it went to black. And that's when Chris saw it. "What's wrong with the fish?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. I was honestly puzzled. He got up from his spot on the couch and started to walk over to the tank. "Chris, don't. Just leave it be." "But the fish." He started to whine a bit. "Seriously, just leave it alone. But before I could finish telling him to get back onto the couch, John began to speak. Or at least I thought he did. Even Amy turned to look at him, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. He was mumbling to himself. "John?" I asked. Still he mumbled, though he was getting a little louder. Amy watched him closely and then repeated what he was saying, her eyes growing wider with every word. "She's gonna die?" She scooted back away from him and into the bend of the sectional, pulling her knees up to her chest. Her face went from an expression of genuine curiosity to one of unease as she bit at her lower lip and knit her brows together. John's repetition of those 3 words over and over, getting a little louder each time, was enough to make even my blood run cold. "Who's gonna die?" Chris asked, his eyes darting back and forth between me and our cousin, who was essentially his best friend. "I don't... Granny, 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 Granny." Again his answer began almost as a whisper and grew louder as he repeated it. Now, let me tell you, it was completely unnerving. I thought maybe he was just trying to play a prank at first, but it didn't take long to realize that he was in some sort of trance. I looked back at the door and the fish tank. The aeration bubbles were no longer making their gentle, soothing, gurgling noise, but were as intense as a boiling pot of water on the stove top over high heat. And the violently moving black water was now sloshy. And the fish, well, they were nowhere to be seen. "Granny's gonna die." He was even louder now, his tone insistent and fearful at the same time. "John, stop it." "She isn't gonna die," I said, trying to get him to come back into reality. I pulled on his arm and got him to his feet. I guess I thought that if I could get him to move around, it might break that trance. But that didn't happen. Oh, he got to his feet for a few seconds, but then he pushed me away so hard that I fell onto the floor in front of him, as he dropped to his knees on the carpeted floor beside me. His hand went straight up into the air, his elbow hyperextending as though something were pulling his hand from above, and then it was dropped to the floor with a thud as he repeated, "She's gonna die." "John, stop," I insisted, and grabbed his shoulder. His hand shot up again, dropping in an instant and forcing me back up until I caught myself and was able to prop up on my elbows. For a moment, I was stunned as I watched him repeat himself over and over again, his hand shooting toward the ceiling, dropping back to the floor. But gradually, as he grew louder, his hand began to pound the floor with increasing force. "John, stop it," I called to him as I noticed my baby brother getting up on the couch and backing into the corner with Amy. Their eyes mirrored one another as curiosity and unease turned into terror. "I don't want Granny to die," Chris began to cry. This was something he wouldn't admit to later. He was always trying to act tough around John, but he was really getting scared. I could tell. That fact suddenly changed my own perspective of what was happening. No, I didn't think that John was faking it. In fact, I was fairly certain that he was possessed or something. I took a second to try and figure out what to do. He just kept repeating himself. "She's gonna die. Granny's going to die." Now this was making me nervous. The grandmother in question was in her late 80s and wasn't in the best of health, and we were all on edge expecting to be told that she'd passed away, but I was fairly certain that John wasn't able to predict this, and it wasn't something that any of us would have joked about. There was a moment that passed as I tried to figure out what to do next, and he just kept repeating those god-awful words. Finally, I decided that the best thing to do was to get him to calm down. So I got onto my knees and I went over to him, and kneeling between him and the sofa, I reached out to touch him. He didn't look up at me. He didn't stop. In fact, his pounding became even more intense, and I was convinced that at any time his fist would go right through our floor. Suddenly there was a rattling at the front door, like someone was trying to get into the house. There was no one out there, and I knew it. But Amy started to move toward the door. "No!" I shouted at her with all the authority I could muster. "Just stay where you are." "But it could be a..." "The phone was dead, Amy. No one knows this is going on. It's not anyone we know. I doubt I was silenced by a loud growl that came from the other side of the door. That's not good. I said this more to myself, but it had an effect on Amy and Chris. Chris began crying harder at that point, his whimpers turning into sobs now. The growling was enough to make him forget about wanting to look cool in front of John. He was scared, and there was no point in hiding it. Amy was even starting to have a hard time keeping the fear out of her eyes. What had started out as a curiosity was quickly turning into something utterly terrifying for us all. John continued his insistent chanting, and the growling intensified. The fish tank remained that muddy, tarry color, and the air bubbles from the filtration system continued to make the water seem to boil. I was silently starting to wish that Mom would wake up, but that wasn't going to happen, at least not for quite some time. The handle rattled as though something were trying to turn it, and I silently thanked God that I had locked it. Living out in the country like we did, it wasn't always something I remembered to do. In that moment, though, I was pretty sure it was something I wouldn't forget again. I'd managed to put my arm around John's shoulder again, trying to catch his arm before his fist slammed into the floor again. Despite the adrenaline high that I was on, my reflexes weren't on par, and I missed several times. My own tears were starting to well up in my eyes, and I wasn't sure that I could keep it together much longer. "John, stop it, please," I pleaded into his ear. "You're scaring us." He continued. The rattling continued. Everything continued. Chris and Amy were both crying, and Chris was begging me to make it all stop over and over between his sobs. Amy pulled Chris closer to her and held on to him. For what it was worth, she was trying to calm him down, but I don't think that much could have soothed him at that point. Something slammed into the front door, causing all of us but John to jump and scream. What happened next was almost involuntary on my part. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it before. I reared back and I slapped John hard across the face. It didn't faze him, and when I realized that, I sat back and began to pray. There was nothing else I could do. Instinct took over, and I just began to recite the Lord's Prayer. When I came to the end, I felt calm for the first time in the better part of 2 hours. As this whole fiasco was unfolding, I stood up, walked to the door, and shouted to whatever was on the other side. "You can't have us! You can't come in here! Go away and never come back!" And I began to pray the same prayer again, only this time Amy's voice joined mine. And as we came to the end, saying Amen, everything went silent. Deathly silent in the whole house. The rattling, banging, and boiling tank stopped. The TV went off. I couldn't even hear Chris's crying. I turned back to see John lying on his side with his knees drawn up to his chest, his head resting on his kneecaps. Everything stopped. Then the noise of the television began to fade back on to a normal level. Amy looked at me and sighed after a long moment, her eyes silently asking if it was all over. I went to John. He was blinking, trying to understand what happened and why he was in the floor. "My hands feel like I punched a wall," he said. The first normal words he'd spoken in the better part of 20 minutes were music to my ears. "More like a floor," I told him. "I'd get you some ice, but I'm not opening that door." "What happened?" I recounted all that we'd experienced. He didn't remember the tank, his prediction, or the growling and banging at the door. He did remember the footprints, and told me to forget the ice. Chris and Amy were in shock, but much calmer. And with all the crazy happenings, I looked at the clock. It was nearly 4 a.m. I suggested that we all just stay on the couch. There's safety in numbers, after all. I grabbed 2 of the quilts from the quilt rack by Mom's room. Her TV was back on as normal, I couldn't explain that because I knew that John had turned it off when we failed to wake her up. But at that point, I didn't care. I was utterly exhausted. I went back to the couch where John took one blanket and I took the other. I sat down between Chris and Amy. We left the lights on, but it took no time for us all to fall asleep. My mother found the four of us the next morning, all huddled together on the sofa. It wasn't until a few years ago that we ever really talked about that night. She had no clue what happened, and though I tried to bring it up a few times over the years with my brother and cousins, none of them ever want to discuss the experience. I can't say that I blame them. It was traumatic and unexplainable. But to this day, I have to wonder what lurks in the mountains, because when I went outside the next day in the sunshine, I had to examine those footprints. They weren't human footprints. It looked more like hoof marks in the snow. But when we were watching, they formed one at a time, as if a person were walking up to the mountain. I have no answers, and probably never will. But that experience has made me more curious than any other about what lies beyond our perception of reality. And it's a big part of why I do what I do today.
Well, there you have it. The end of our tale. Thus concludes our little winter in July. I do hope you enjoyed the story, and if you did, please consider giving us that little thumbs up and like the video, as well as making sure you subscribe to the channel and click that notification bell so that you will know the next time we produce a story. I have some wonderful things on the burner for you, and I'm working on the narration editing for 3 different tales that will be coming out in August and September for other authors, so stay tuned for that. If you like my work, I write under the pen name of Belle, and you can find all of the information for my books at the links below in the description box. If you would like to submit, we do have room for more authors and stories. Information on how to submit your work for narration is below as well. You can always sign up and take a look at our Facebook group or our Twitter feed for more information as we get our social media presence going. Until next time, everyone, stay safe and, well, have a good night.